Hey, welcome. Today, we're diving into a fascinating new survey that's uncovered a really deep sense of anxiety spreading across Europe. It seems a perfect storm of political shocks is changing how Europeans see their world, their allies, and maybe most importantly, their own security. Let's get into it. So, this image really sets the stage for what we're talking about today. A huge 9-country survey has just come out, and it basically paints a picture of a continent that's, well, it's on edge. It feels like it's living under this big cloud of uncertainty. The data we're going to look at shows a Europe feeling vulnerable in ways it just hasn't in decades. And listen to this quote from Jean-Yves Dormagen, who founded the polling agency behind the survey. He says Europe is anxious, aware of its vulnerabilities, and struggling to project itself into the future. So in this explainer, we're going to break down the 3 big reasons why: a distrusted ally, a feared adversary, and a really deep sense of its own weakness. Okay, so let's tackle that first driver, a distrusted ally. And wow, this slide is pretty staggering. Almost half of all Europeans surveyed see the US president as an enemy of Europe. And when you break it down, it's even more intense. I mean, look at Belgium, 62%. France isn't far behind at 57%. Now, Poland is a bit of an outlier, but the overall trend here is pretty hard to ignore. But here's where it gets really interesting. Even though many see this America first, more transactional approach as a hostile force, Europeans are also being super pragmatic about it. Almost the exact same number, 48%, believe the EU should try to find a compromise with the US. So what does that tell you? There's this huge distrust in the leader's style, but also a clear-eyed understanding that, hey, the relationship with America is still absolutely critical. So where does all this anxiety actually come from? Well, this slide gives us a big clue. This isn't just some abstract feeling. It's tied to very real events, like the war in Ukraine. The number one fear for Europeans seems to be this: a peace deal getting hammered out between Washington and Moscow, with Europe left completely on the sidelines. And that would, of course, seriously weaken its own security. All right, on to the second driver, a feared adversary. And this is a big one. For the first time in, well, generations, a majority of Europeans, 51%, think a direct war with Russia is a real possibility. I mean, as the quote here says, this was just unthinkable a few years ago. It really marks a massive shift in how people in Europe are thinking. But this fear, it's not the same everywhere. It's not felt equally across the continent. This map shows that pretty dramatically. If you're in Poland, right there on the front line, a mind-blowing 77% see the risk of war as high. But if you go all the way over to Portugal, that number drops to 39%. It just goes to show you, proximity to the threat makes it feel so much more immediate. So you've got this distrusted ally on one side and a feared adversary on the other. And what happens when you're caught in the middle like that? Well, the result is this profound sense of weakness. A staggering 69% of Europeans believe their own country just can't defend itself against Russian aggression. It feels like we're walking into a new, dangerous era, but with this nagging feeling of national weakness. And this feeling of being vulnerable, it's everywhere. Just take France, which is the most confident country they surveyed. Even there, only 44% of people think it can defend itself. That's still a minority. And in Poland, where the threat feels so real and they're investing heavily in defense, 58% still don't feel confident. The big takeaway here is that nobody feels truly secure on their own anymore. It's easy to think this is all about tanks and soldiers, but it's not. The number one thing people cited as a source of insecurity was actually technological and digital security. In fact, only 12% of people said they feel secure from any kind of threat. Think about that. It's this widespread feeling that really touches on every part of modern life. Okay, so you've got this unreliable ally, this scary adversary, and this deep feeling of weakness. What do you do? Well, the response is pretty clear. People are turning inward. A huge 69% are looking to the European Union for protection. They're essentially placing their bets on the Union to provide that collective security and stability. And this isn't just a fleeting thought. This desire for a stronger EU is built on some really solid support. On average, 74% of people want their country to stay in the EU. Even in places you might think are more skeptical, like France and Poland, a big majority still backs their membership. So what's pushing everyone back towards the EU? Well, for one thing, just look across the channel. 5 years after Brexit, about 63% of Europeans think leaving the Union has been a bad thing for Britain.
You could say Brexit is acting like a giant cautionary sail, making the EU look like the only really credible anchor in a pretty unstable world.
So let's put all the pieces together, right? This slide sums up the whole story we've been walking through. It all starts with the external drivers, a US ally you can't quite trust, and a Russian adversary you definitely fear. That leads to the internal condition, this widespread anxiety and sense of vulnerability. And what's the response? A strategic pivot toward the EU for that collective security.
And what's really important to get here is that this isn't just about a bad mood or a tough year. As Dermagen says, it signals the shift of European opinion toward a new geopolitical regime. The idea of a real conflict happening on the continent is now widely accepted as a possibility, and that signals a fundamental, maybe even permanent change in how Europeans see their world.
And that, of course, leaves us with one big final question. As this new, more anxious, and more self-reliant Europe starts looking inward to the EU for its security, what does this new chapter mean for its role on the global stage? Definitely something to think about. Thanks so much for joining me.